Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to this hard talk session on transformation as part of the Resilience for the Urban Poor Forum 2021. My name's David Dodman. I work at the International Institute for Environment and Development, and we have a great panel to join in these hard talk questions, who I'll introduce in a few moments. As I said, the theme for this session is transformation. And transformation is one of the words that frequently gets used when we're talking about the changes that need to be made to build resilience for the urban poor. And it's also a challenging word. Sometimes we understand transformation simply as meaning something very big or large. Sometimes we're using it to refer to things which are perhaps more significant changes to structures or functions or ways of operating within cities. One thing is clear, though, that the current situation facing low-income groups in urban areas in Asia and around the world is not a situation that any of us should be comfortable with accepting. And so the discussion today will be around the nature of some of the changes that need to be made, whether and how transformation is an appropriate lens for thinking about these, and what transformation might look like in practice. So the premise for this session is that solutions to making the urban poor more resilient need to go beyond business as usual and need to consider some of the underlying drivers which create risk, that we can't just offer piecemeal solutions to specific hazards, but rather need to think about what the structures are, the ways in which cities are created and function, and how these can be modified, tweaked by a range of significant actors in order to make the urban poor more resilient, but also to contribute to the broader resilience of cities, their economic function, their cultural function, and their function as a home for a growing number of people in the region and around the world. And so in this session, we'll highlight some examples as well of ways to make resilience initiatives more transformational, and talk about some of the changes that are needed, the organizational, the financial, the policy changes that are needed, the challenges that these present, and the opportunities that we will have to achieve more transformational change. We're going to be looking at this from the perspectives of a broad panel. But what I'm going to do is request you to look at a poll question, two poll questions as a starting point for understanding the engagement around this topic. So if you're engaging with this session through the platform, you'll see a link to poll questions. And if you'd like, please go to those poll questions now and provide your responses. The first question is about the understandings of the term transformation. And the second is about the usefulness, the utility of transformation in terms of a concept for supporting building resilience of the urban poor. So I'm going to pause for 30 seconds whilst people have a chance to go to that poll, and then I'll introduce the panel. And after I've introduced the panel, we'll look at the poll results. So if anyone has just joined during that period of silence, that was for completing the poll, which is available on the online platform. I see we've had a couple of responses coming in, but if you're there and would like to complete the poll, please go into that and do so. So the panel in this hard talk will be responding to a set of questions about transformation. And we have three panelists who bring complementary but perhaps slightly contrasting perspectives to the issues that we're going to be discussing. On the panel, we have Virender Sharma, who's a Principal Urban Development Specialist at the Asian Development Bank. who is a program manager for the Urban Climate Change Resilience Trust Fund. So a development professional who's working within a trust fund, a donor-sponsored trust fund within the Asian Development Bank. We have Smita Rawood, who's the Urban Resilience Lead at the World Resources Institute, who leads the Urban Water Resilience Initiative in Africa. She's helped the development of the Accelerate Access Coalition in India. She's worked at the Global Resilient Cities Network. So Smita comes very strongly from a linked research and practice perspective, and we're very pleased to have her with us. And we have Kirsten MacDonald, who's an Associate Principal in International Development at Arup, the international civil engineering firm. Kirsten's worked a lot on designing and delivering programs and projects throughout Asia, Australia, and the Pacific, including working on the Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network and the Urban Climate Change Resilience Trust Fund. So Kirsten comes from a perspective based within the private sector, but one that's been very engaged with significant resilience programming with municipal governments around Asia and beyond. So we're very pleased to have Verinda, Smita, and Kirsten with us. I think we can now begin to turn to the poll to see if we've had responses. I think we only see one response to the question about the best description of the understanding of the term transformation. And the response that we have here is one that highlights the integrated approach to addressing multiple dimensions of resilience for the urban poor. So not large-scale infrastructural projects or large-scale social projects, but a more integrated approach. And if the producer can turn to the second poll question, if that's possible as well, if we have responses there. No responses to the second question, but in this question we're asking about the usefulness of the term transformation, with a few options about whether it captures the scale of issues or highlights the need for going beyond sectoral approaches. And the response that's just come in is yes, it does capture the scale of issues. But we also, there were a couple of negative options. There's whether it's acceptable or not to political decision makers, whether it lacks practical specificity and applicability. So those were some of the contrasting perspectives, perhaps, on the understandings of the term transformation and on the usefulness of the term. And we see now we're getting a few more comments in. And actually, I think I'll leave this one just for another 30 or 40 seconds, just to see where we end up on this, because this is actually quite interesting to see perspectives coming in. Is it possible to go back to the first question again, producer, just to see if there are any changes that have come in there, to look briefly? Okay, so there's no changes in the first one. So if we go to the second and just observe that briefly, and then we'll move into the questions. So we're seeing here quite a split between feeling that transformation is a useful term or not a useful term, and not useful is creeping into the lead, which I think makes an interesting starting point for this discussion, because I think in certain circles, transformation is seen as quite straightforward as being a positive thing to engage with. And whereas if we see that there's a feeling that the lack of practical specificity and applicability is a major challenge, maybe that's something that our panelists could respond to as well. Having said that, there are quite a few positive responses as well, recognizing transformation as capturing the scale of the issues to be addressed and the need to go beyond sectoral projects. So thanks very much, and we might have a chance just to see where the poll ends up at the end of the session as well, if people complete it while we're listening to the panelists. Thank you for your inputs. I'd like us now to move to the panelists, who we can see on the screen now. And from the top left, I'm in the circle, then it's Smita, then it's Kirsten McDonald with Virinder at the centre of the bottom. And I'd like to ask all the panelists firstly to reflect on new approaches to building resilience, and whether the challenges posed by climate change do create the need to address urban poverty in a more transformative manner, and how a focus on transformation might lead to changes in programming around urban poverty and climate resilience. And I'd like to start this round with Virinder, and then I'll go to Kirsten and Smita. So Virinder, your thoughts on how a focus on transformation might lead to changes in programming.
Okay, thank you very much, David, for this. I think we've made a good start as far as the session is concerned. I was particularly, looking at the questions and the responses that were coming in, and I think somewhere when we are introducing the terms transformation, resilience, I think what and how these articulate with people on the ground, it's really important to remember. And I think there is a gap between what we as professionals are discussing and thinking about and what people on the ground, and especially the urban poor, who are supposed to be our the focus of this session, feel. I do think that multiple and compounding risks are being faced by the urban poor, and climate change is one of them. And of course, there are other shocks and stresses that they regularly face. And it's always a challenge to see, how does the climate dimension make it more imperative to address urban poverty in a more transformative manner. I think the issue is that how do you deal with multiple risks? And that means that multiple risks have to be dealt in beyond our current sectoral approach, which is, this whole integrated approach that people talked about. In both the questions, I think there was that reflection people mentioned about transformation and integrated approach. But how do you achieve it is the real challenge. And I feel that, of course, the pandemic, then the compounding of climate change, plus the other shocks and stresses together is really putting to us very fundamental questions on our current approach in terms of city development. And if we really want to address urban poverty and make a difference there, then what would be that transformation be? And this also, then reflects on the programming and the projects that we do. But I think just as a beginning, I'll stop there and back to you, David. So there's need for more clarity around these terminologies, not just for us professionals, but people on the ground who are now not perhaps moving in the same speed as us professionals are moving in terms of changing our terminologies and way we deliver development. Thank you. Back to you, David.
Thank you, Virinder. And I'd like to pose the same question to Kirsten.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Virinder. Yes, just to reiterate some of what Virinder said, the climate change does create the need to address urban poverty in a more transformative manner. We know that the future impacts of climate change are uncertain. We know that the combination of climate change and other shocks and stresses, such as we've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic, increases that uncertainty. We also know that climate change exacerbates the root causes or underlying drivers of poverty. We know that while coping mechanisms and incremental adaptation enable households and communities to survive extreme events and respond to immediate shocks and stresses, they don't address those root causes, such as root causes of poverty, such as income, poverty, gender norms, and so on. So responding to future and uncertain shocks and stresses does require transformation of those root causes or underlying drivers of poverty through a focus on changing their fundamental attributes. And what that might mean for changes in programming around urban poverty and climate resilience, I guess, can be informed by some recent research undertaken by the ADB that's found that a focus on transformation will require national municipal governments to focus on a number of 6 policy areas, in fact, and 3 aspects of the enabling environment. And this research has found that when these policy areas are addressed, address the root causes of vulnerability to climate change and disaster risk, then governments can bring about transformational change. So perhaps to the point Verinda made and the feedback that came through in the poll, focusing less on the terminology transformational change and more on the actions or the interventions or the work that's needed to bring about that change, to target those root causes of vulnerability to climate change and disaster risk in cities is perhaps what the focus should be. Back to you, David.
Great, thank you. And Smita, can we have your opening reflections on this as well, about how a focus on transformation might shape changes in programming around urban poverty and resilience?
Thank you, David, and thank you to the speakers who preceded me. I think I would agree that, to me, it seems like climate change and the uncertainties that we are facing in the future will require transformation in all fields of planning. It will require ability to deal with scenarios which are uncertain, ability to respond to future contexts which are still evolving, and ability to take into realization that past vulnerabilities will be exacerbated with these future risk scenarios that are emerging. And so how we respond to that is, I agree, more a question of how we act together. We already know, even with the climate change impacts that we are seeing today, that climate change and the related disasters don't follow jurisdictional boundaries, they have cascading impacts from one infrastructure element to another. You could have a power loss leading to water shortages. You could have water shortages leading to other kinds of medical emergencies and other aspects. So these are, in the practice of climate resilience, we already know that silo busting is required. We do need to work across sectors. We need to work in an integrated manner. And I think what it brings to the fore is that perhaps new kinds of partnerships are required amongst practitioners, both in the context of this particular question, perhaps partnerships are required between the climate resilience practitioners and the practitioners working on anti-poverty programs, basic access programs, and things like that. And those kind of practical approaches of working in an integrated manner, addressing multiple risks at the same time to make the best use of resources that are available and best use of knowledge that is available on all aspects is what I would think would be critical as we move forward. And it does require transformation to a large extent, because I feel that our current practices are not going to be sufficient to address the future risk scenarios. So transformation from a practice perspective is certainly required, whether we use the term or whether that term is accessible to the people that we are serving is certainly a question, as Virendra pointed out and Kirsten pointed out. And I think to me, it's a question of how we think about our practice in the future is the critical question to be answered and responded to. Thank you, David. Back to you.
Thanks, everyone. And I think we've had some really interesting and useful points there about the what makes us need new approaches to building resilience. I think highlighting cascading risk and cross-border risk, where we can no longer, if we ever could, we certainly can't contain risk within small geographical areas or within sectors. The challenges of uncertainty. I mean, we are certain about the overall direction of travel in terms of climate change, and the latest IPCC findings are extremely clear on that and accepted even within COP26, but how that then works out in the ground in specific circumstances is definitely uncertain and requires different ways of planning. And I think this gap between what professionals are thinking and what is happening on the ground is very significant as well here in this space. I'd like us to move on to talking a bit more about the operationalization of work on building resilience for the urban poor with a more transformative lens. And I'd like to ask the panelists to reflect on the extent to which a transformative approach might be doing existing things at a larger scale, or doing things differently, or bits of both. About how transformation, both of the scale and the type that is needed, can be done while at the same time ensuring that urban poverty is addressed in an inclusive way, including, as Kirsten highlighted, taking gender issues into account. And ask the panelists as well if they have any specific examples of program measures or interventions that are helpful to consider while designing solutions to build resilience for the urban poor. So we'll go in a different order this time. We'll go Kirsten, then Smita, then Virendra. What are your thoughts on operationalizing transformation for the urban poor, Kirsten?
Thank you, David. I think just wanted to sort of start on just back to one point you made. I think that when in our previous discussion around this idea of transformation, I think, and Smita might have referenced this, there's already work going underway. I think you referred to this, David. There are small scale actions or activities in place already. So coping mechanisms that can be built on existing approaches to incremental adaptation that is already happening, that forms the basis for any transformational change. I mean, but to the question for this part of the discussion, is building resilience more about doing existing things at scale or doing things differently? I mean, both, definitely. But perhaps the starting point might be doing things differently. So starting with changing the way in which, so for national governments, for example, we need to achieve this systemic change. There's an opportunity to change the way in which governments are currently enabling actions in urban municipalities to build and towns to build resilience. Through strengthening design and delivery program policies and programs to enable urban poor to adapt to the range of impacts. And I guess policy change provides the opportunity to get to resilience at scale. So it's starting with changing the way in which we are doing things differently by working, to Smita's point, across silos, working at every scale. And then through policy change, that does provide an opportunity to get to resilience at scale. And then I think that there's, the recent research of the ADB has shown that there's, in terms of policies, that could be the focus and could assist to getting to this sort of idea of transformational change at scale. There's a number of policy areas on which to focus, where action or change is required in order to achieve transformation. And they're around urban planning, social protection, public health, livelihoods, housing, and infrastructure. We've heard a bit about that in previous sessions today. And I guess then to the next part of the question, I mean, how can these initiatives be operationalised while ensuring inclusive and gendered focus? I mean, I think from a starting point, it's by adopting a principle of subsidiarity, so that decisions are made at that sort of lowest competent level, and so by engaging with urban poor and near poor households directly, leveraging those with existing networks such as local NGOs and so on, leveraging existing programs that are working directly with urban poor and near poor households, and then enabling those groups with appropriate resourcing. I think I'll hand it over.
Right, thanks very much, Kirsten, and a lot of really relevant points there as well, particularly around operationalising with the people who we're trying to work with to build resilience. Smita, can I ask you to comment on this issue of operationalisation, inclusion, and perhaps specific programme measures or interventions?
Yeah, thank you, David. And maybe I'll, talk about some specific ways of programmatic action that we are looking at currently in the urban water resilience work that we are doing in India and Africa. I think one of the things that we are really reflecting on is new kinds of partnerships, right? We tend to do a lot of research on data analytics, but we are really rethinking what kind of data should we analyze. We know how to do climate modeling, climate risk assessment as a research organization with a lot of expertise in that area. But we really need to fill the gaps where we don't traditionally work, right? So we are, for example, in our open water resilience work in India, we are partnering with local NGOs working at the grassroots level. We are partnering with Mahila Housing Trust. We recently conducted a study with them where we did a household level survey across 16 informal communities in 8 cities in India to really understand how the lack of access to water and sanitation services and healthy spaces are impacting communities who are already facing flood risks and high levels of, even higher levels of limited access due to certain drought conditions and day zero conditions in many Indian cities. And so what are the levels of services? What is accessible? What are the kind of off-grid on-site services which these communities already rely on? What are the resiliency factors in those kind of services that we should actually learn from, and how can we improve them? Because as we all know, a lot of the challenges are that these on-site services that these communities are dependent on and rely on, because in a lot of cases they've been marginalized with no access to kind of the mainstream infrastructure. there's a lot of resiliency in the way these services operate and are able to actually cope with when the mainstream infrastructure fails. So the question really is, rather than further marginalizing the service providers or the services that are being provided, how do we strengthen them? How do we integrate them? How do we further support improvements in those services? How do we propose regulatory policies or urban policies which are inclusive of those kinds of services that are being delivered, and actually help set up kind of incremental approaches to improve those services, work with those private service providers, understand what their needs are to improve the services that they are providing to the communities, which are often do not have any access to public services. And so really changing the way we think about what are the centralized systems of services versus the decentralized systems of services, which are often more affordable, more low cost, and in fact, low carbon, because they do not spend the amount of energy that is required in conveyance and distribution of the centralized infrastructure and the treatment plants and all those things that are required, right? So I think we need to have a shift on what we think are the right solutions and how those solutions could be potentially rethought in the context of being able to serve the communities which are most in need and at the highest risk in a manner that is low cost, innovative, strategic, but still integrated. You know how? So I mean, there are many examples that are emerging, and I hope we'll have a chance to discuss those specific examples as we talk about some of the other questions. But certainly, there are low-cost solutions for nature-based strategies to treat wastewater, which can be done at a local level. There are solar composting toilets facilities, which are now working completely on solar systems, are completely off-grid, are communal toilet systems that are being built, which also compost the waste and produce energy. These things can be locally managed, but they do introduce a complexity of governance, right? Who governs them? What is the long-term sustainability and viability? Who manages these services? So how can we work to make sure these services can still be these kind of new innovations that are being improved, constantly improved and served? How can they be better integrated? What are the ways of making them mainstream, and what are potential approaches to really, we have to think of both near-term improvements and long-term. We cannot, we have to be practical in how services can be improved today, because they're actually impacting lives, livelihoods, productivity issues, human health issues today on a day-to-day basis for these communities. So we cannot think about only the long term. We have to think about both the near term, what can be done now, but can be done in an integrated manner, can be looked at in terms of long-term governance and management, and in a sustainable manner. But new ways of thinking about services and service provision would be one of the key aspects I would like to highlight as coming out of our work in cities.
It's fantastic to get those specific examples there, Smita, as well, and also the recognition of working with rather than working against the solutions that people find for themselves. That so much of the urban structure, urban fabric, the neighborhoods and communities, the infrastructure is not created by governments and by government agencies, but for the urban poor is often created by the urban poor themselves. And how to work with that, I think, is one of the challenging issues, but also one that we need to engage with very, very deeply. And Verinda, can we have your thoughts and from your perspective on this issue of operationalization?
Thank you very much. I think both Kirsten and Smita have covered some of the areas. What I would like to give, two examples on how we can operationalize, and I think let's focus on the current Climate Change Trust Fund, the UCCRTF, because we are working both at the policy space and also on the ground. And, looking at operationalization, I think we need both. We need the larger scale. And that's why we're working with ADB, and this trust fund, supports the core programs of ADB, but builds resilience within them. And then secondly, doing differently. So I'll illustrate it by two examples at the policy level. Of course, my example is the resilience for urban poor, this forum itself, and the work that IID, David, Argo, UP have been doing in, first of all, I think bringing that focus on urban poverty. I think the work that you did in 3 countries, Philippines, Bangladesh, and Indonesia, where you started working right at the top with the planning commissions, the policy instruments of the government, bringing them together because, as we said earlier, that this siloed nature of working doesn't really benefit the urban poor, and that cannot really build the resilience of urban poor. So I would say that this whole work that has been done and supported by the Urban Trust Fund is the focus of bringing urban poor center stage. And of course, through your work on policy analysis, diagnostics that you've done across with a number of the DMC governments and their departments, bringing them together, trying to look at the various schemes and programs that they have for urban poor and how they start linking up with each other and trying to avoid the duplication that in most cases is being done, both in terms of delivery of services, but also in terms of the institutional structures that have been set up. And I would say that, because a lot of the impediments to transformation and achieving resilience are inherent in our institutions. That process of transformation of institutions is critical. So whether you call them the governance changes or whether you call them the policy changes, even the political economy issues were brought in through this process. And I would say that this then allowed the planning that was done, the country partnership strategy that ADB does with these 3 countries, bringing resilience and urban poor right in focus, and to then impact upon the governments to have very specific programs which address the resilience of the urban poor. So that's the long-term objective of it. And I would say that, the process has gone off very well, and we would certainly achieve the longer-term transformation that we are talking about in terms of governments coming to ADB and saying that, we don't want this sector program, but this is our integrated program on working for building the resilience of urban poor. So that's one of the examples at the policy level. The other example is at the ground level. And again, the trust fund has perhaps one of the largest contracts that we have with an NGO, Oxfam in this case, in ADB. And despite because most of the procurement systems are built for larger loans and larger infrastructure, but this was a journey for us to learn how to manage these smaller contracts through NGOs, civil society organizations. And Oxfam was able to mobilize a lot of civil society and indigenous organizations on the ground. And we have now 8 community-led projects. These projects are happening in the same cities where the ADB loans are working, but they are covering precisely the communities that Smita was mentioning. So they actually went out and said, this is the area that has been left out. This is where, the poor live, based on the assessment and the mapping that was done. And then in discussion with them, what exactly is your problem and how do you want to solve it? Not us coming and giving them a solution, but trying to understand, what their problem is from the multi-sectoral perspective, multiple risk perspective. And now we have come up with these 8 community-led projects handled purely by civil society, a lot of lessons coming on co-creation and co-design with the communities. They might be, asking for standard things like, a specific, water treatment facility very much for the communities, a facility around waste segregation for the communities. But what we feel is that whatever has come out of that whole work on the CLPs is very much the aspirations of the community. And then we try to bring complementarity with that work and where the larger loan is working. So again, I would say that this is a good example of, how you build transformation within institutions, where you pick up a smaller project, do it differently as you're, doing things differently, and then pick up the lessons from that. And what we have seen is now the city governments themselves are willing to put money, resources and contribution, land and other things in taking those projects forward. And the lessons that we are getting on this unique experiment of CSO engagement are now being picked up by the social development thematic group within ADB and being integrated into their standard planning processes around safeguards and project design and implementation. So I would say that, these examples really give us that glimpse on how the transformation can be achieved and where you can start both at the policy level and also on the field level and the ground level. Thank you very much. Back to you, David.
Thank you. And there's something extremely significant there, I think, about both recognizing the structural modalities within which we have to function, but also thinking about how to change them in response to the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And it seems to me as well that there's something really quite profound about meeting in the middle, about challenges to find new modalities of finance, but also of operating as a financial institution, but also of the need for recipient organizations to find new ways of working with these financial flows as well. And maybe we'll come back to some of these questions about finance for transformation in the last round of questions. I'd like to indicate to everybody who's watching that we do have the opportunity for Q&A. If you go on I believe it's the right-hand side of your of the platform panel, you can write your own questions into the box there. We've got something in there at the moment. But maybe if, as the panel goes through the last question that I have on my list, if you have questions that you would like to add for the panel, please do so, and we should be able to return to those. So the final question I'd like to ask is around opportunities and good practices. And we've already begun to touch on what it takes to put transformation into practice. And it'd be good to know from everyone whether there are similar experiences of transformational solutions in other Asian countries. But perhaps to focus on two things. One is the potential for scaling up and replication, because we know there are thousands of cities across Asia and around the world. It's very significant to have strong examples in a few places, but really we need to go to scale. So there are examples about going to scale or about replicating, and about ways of doing this in ways that is accessible and inclusive, recognizing the diversity of the urban poor as well as their common characteristics. So this time round, we'll go to Smita, then Virender, then Kirsten. What can you say about opportunities, good practices, scaling up replication and inclusion? Smita.
Thank you, David. So I think, scale also requires complementarity of expertise to come together, right? Because we already know, and we have spoken about it, the traditional siloed approaches are not going to work. So I think it is important to give you some examples. This is exactly the reason why we set up the Accelerate Access Coalition in India, working specifically on solutions for inclusive and resilient access to water and sanitation services for the urban poor. The goal of this coalition is to really bring together complementarity in expertise from organizations that work in wash services, organizations that work in resource management, water resource management, organizations that work in rescue and recovery efforts, organizations that work in or invest in social entrepreneurship through various funds, localized funds. So we have organizations right from WaterAid, water.org, IRC, Waste, CDD, a lot of these organizations, Mahila Housing Trust, a lot of these organizations, including a number of national policy advisory institutions who are part of this, and a number of research institutes like ourselves, like number of locally based research organizations which are part of it, because we wanted to create a forum where all these organizations are able to learn from each other. Second, create a joint platform for proposing key areas of action within the access to water and sanitation space, how that space is interacting with emerging water scarcities in many cities in the country, how you can take both an upstream kind of risk approach while responding to downstream risks that these communities are already facing in terms of supply and distribution and access issues. So really we wanted to create a forum where these different organizations with their complementary expertise can come together, have a joint platform to share their knowledge resources, engage with public sector stakeholders, including local governments, state governments, and national governments, to share the kind of approaches that can be integrated to develop more solutions that are integrated across many cities in the country. We also involved a number of investment funds in this consortium, like Take a Stake Fund, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, a number of different organizations who are working on innovation aspects of solutioning, on low carbon solutions, off-grid solutions, new kind of point of use treatment solutions, and things like that. And the reason for this is to look at the entire value chain of supply and distribution of water resources and sanitation services. And so that's one approach to scaling that we are taking in by building these large coalitions which can not only act as communities of practice and share information, but also advocate for more integrated approaches and policy change at the national level, and more focus on inclusive and resilient access to basic services, which is quite needed in these communities. A similar approach that we are taking in our Africa Urban Water Resilience Initiative is while we are working in 6 different cities on developing a city-level water resilience assessment, which is multi-sectoral and engages in a structured kind of a multi-stakeholder planning process using the city water resilience approach. While we are developing that, along with partners like ARUP, the Resilient Shift, and others, in 6 specific cities, what we are also trying to assemble is we are trying to assemble a Pan-African coalition where we are trying to really bring attention as Africa and urbanizes in the near decades, and how can some of the initiatives that have been so far focused on rural access and rural poverty issues can focus on urban poverty issues and look at water services in particular, because as we all know, Africa is a very water-stressed continent, and future climate change risks are only going to exacerbate availability of water in a continent which is already has low per capita water availability. And so how can we start proactively looking for the kinds of shifts that are needed in terms of policy at the national level? Because a lot of the investment and policy is still in a lot of African countries is kind of mandated at the national level. So how can we change and influence policy at the national level while working with city governments to inform what are the kinds of policy shifts that are needed at the national level, and to really bring about that kind of scalar change? So working both at the ground, but then assembling coalitions which can influence at the national and global level to create a better enabling environment for city governments, for local institutions to take the kind of policy action that they need to take to address future risks. So that's the kind of approach. 2 examples I wanted to share with you that we are taking to address both the scale issue and the integration issue at the same time.
And I think it's really important that we don't think that climate resilience starts with a blank slate, that so many of the efforts that have been made in the wash sector, in the housing sector, in the DRR sector also give us examples for how to address these sorts of challenges, including the challenges that have significant levels of uncertainty at scale. Virender, would you like to comment on this point as well?
Okay, thank you very much, David. I was, just wanting to reflect back on some of the takeaways that could be coming from this session and this discussion, just to make it more interesting for the audience. And I was trying to note down things. So I've got about 5 points, which I can just, quickly go through. One is, of course, understanding the root causes. I think many a time we are working around proximate causes, and we feel that these are the ones that are going to solve it, but we don't really go to the root causes. And of course, that requires much more accountability, transparency, and empowerment within and across institutions if we really want to build resilience and see the transformation of individuals and institutions. As I mentioned earlier, that our bottlenecks and our barriers and our challenges are within institutions and within individuals. The second is, of course, reporting, monitoring, and outcomes, moving beyond just inputs and outputs. Governments and large organizations are very happy with process-type monitoring. That is not sufficient. I think outcome monitoring is really important. This is being emphasized, but it's always difficult, especially when you have to achieve building resilience of X million people in X time. How do you, measure it? What baselines do you set in? And that's what the Trust Fund has been doing, both with baseline and line monitoring. Third, ADB has already started looking at, making cities more livable, which is one of the operational priority. And we are responsible for operationalizing it. And that means that beyond the standard infrastructure projects that we have, especially water and sanitation? How do we move into areas like nature-based solutions, cross-boundary air pollution, flood early warning systems? I mentioned about the informal settlements and their specific problems, the community-led projects that I mentioned. Now, these are things that are being supported by the Trust Fund through technical assistance and, of course, grant financing also as a part of the Trust Fund. But important is, and that's a lesson that we are learning in the Trust Fund, is how do we move beyond these technical assistance to co-financing with the loan, so that the governments themselves feel that these are integral part of their work. For example, in Vietnam, pushing the whole envelope on nature-based solutions, green and grey infrastructure together has been a real challenge. The next point is around climate change. Of course, we mentioned a lot about climate risk and how do we, what does it mean for the poor people and the urban poor? And here, I think getting, it's not easy to translate climate models into what it means for specific location, design, and the delivery of the infrastructure. And that's another area that I think is really important, where you are trying to translate these things so that these become integral to the standard designs and the return periods that engineers usually use for building infrastructure, coupled with that. And finally, I think my point is around how do we bring climate, environment, social, and health issues together. And again, from that perspective, where we see these as distinct, sectors or perhaps subsectors, from the perspective of building resilience of the urban poor, I think they are very much integrated, but the institutions are not designed according to that. And it's important to, for example, we are working very closely with the ADB safeguards approach, where you are looking very critically at environmental and social issues. How do you bring labor standards? How do you bring health issues in that? And how do you bring climate risk and other issues within that? So I just wanted to share these 5 points, which are lessons that are coming from our trust fund, and we hope that in the next version of the trust fund, which has just been approved at the COP by the UK FCDO, we will certainly build on our mistakes and learn lessons from our failures in terms of building, because there is no one solution, and I think that's how we want to go ahead with this challenge. So back to you, David, on these.
Thank you. Thank you, Verinda. And we give Kirsten the disadvantage of only having a brief time, but the advantage of it being the final word before we close this session. So Kirsten, to you.
Well, the final word is I would say that in terms of scaling and replicating good practice, I think in every, and there'll be many people listening this evening or this afternoon for whom there is already action underway in their cities. And one of the key elements of replicating good practice and then scaling is the ability to reflect and learn. And I think all of our respondents have mentioned that. So to reflect on the experiences of implementation, capture the learning, document the learning, disseminate the learning, and then and then replicate again, and then scale. So, and the very process of reflective learning contributes to building resilience. And I think we've learned that from much of the work that those on the call have been involved in over the years. So David, I would hand that back to you to conclude.
Thank you, and a very strong point for getting close to the wrap-up of this session. So I'd like just to mention we have had a couple of comments coming in, which I think I will add in as comments rather than questions. One is about the recognizing that transformation is about moving from one point to another. And so the need to reflect on what point on a spectrum we might be wanting to move from in our efforts of resilience, and what a transformative spectrum might look like if it's not perhaps possible to do everything all at once. The second one, I think, is a topic it would have been good to engage more with, and perhaps we can put this into the pot for discussion throughout this forum, which is about leadership. Who should be leading transformational adaptation if it involves different sectors at different levels of society? And I think we've very strongly made the point that transformation, or that building resilience for the urban poor in a way that isn't business as usual, needs to cut across silos and sectors. But that does lead to a challenge in terms of where is the coordination or the leadership function. And I think we do have examples where strong leadership has been shown by particular agencies in different places. But perhaps this is something that we haven't had in our discussions today. So we are at time. My first task now is to thank Verinda, Kirsten and Smita very much for their inputs, for joining at very different times of the day. I think it's still the middle of last night for Smita. It's breakfast time for me in the UK. It's dinner time for Kirsten in Australia. One of the joys of doing these things virtually is the ability to include people from around the world. So thank you very, very much for the time you've taken to engage, prepare and join this session. I'd also like to ask the participants on the right-hand side of the screen, there is a feedback tab. It only takes a minute to complete. So please do take a minute to click on that feedback tab so that we can know how to run these sessions even better in the future. And if you do require a certificate of attendance, there is the option to request one of those by clicking on the tab on the left side of the screen. So thank you very much to the AVB for organising this. Thank you once again to the panelists. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today. And we hope that you found this hard talk session interesting, inspiring, and perhaps even useful in terms of efforts for contributing to building resilience of the urban poor. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are.